John. Can you hear me?
It's not on.
Can you hear me now? Well, thank you all. And today I'd like to share a story with you about something that happened when I was living and working in Vietnam. It was March of 1999, and Jean and I, Jean is sitting right there, Jean and I were invited to the premiere of a movie about the My Lai massacre. And the invitation said that a special guest to this premiere would attend, the American ambassador to Vietnam. And we thought that was an interesting choice because Pete Peterson he was the first American ambassador to Vietnam. And he had actually spent 6 years in prison in Hanoi. And so we thought it was an interesting choice that he would attend a movie about the My Lai massacre. So with a little bit of nervousness, and both because of the subject and because of our nationality, we made our way across Hanoi that evening to the new National Cinema Center in Hanoi. In our 4 years living and working in Vietnam, it was not frequent that Americans and Vietnamese met together in big groups within an organization or in a formal setting they did. But that night was different. I recall the theater being very full with a very unusual mixture of Vietnamese and Americans. And because Jean and I tended to stick with the Vietnamese, it was an unusual night for us too to be in a group like that. The film, which was called The Sound of a Violin at My Lai, was very powerful and very graphic. And at the end of the showing, when the lights came up, there was a lot of tension in the room with this mixture of Vietnamese and Americans. And you can imagine the tension. The lights came up, and then the American ambassador was invited to say a few words. And I did not envy him to have the lights come up in front of a crowd like that and be after a movie like that and to be invited to speak. And what can he say to a group of Vietnamese, mostly who were veterans in a moment like that? What can somebody who had been imprisoned for 6 years in that very city say after seeing the horrible images? What was going on in his mind, in his heart? He seemed shocked that evening, just like the rest of us were, and he struggled to speak. In the end, he stood up in front of this big crowd, and he said these words, holding his fingers an inch apart: "In war, you are this close to being a savage." The poor Vietnamese translator floundered with the word savage, which was heartbreaking, and the tension in the room only grew. Since that evening, I've thought a lot about what Ambassador Peterson said, and I've come to agree with what he said. It perhaps was not the best moment to say those words. It perhaps was a little bit inarticulate, but I think it's true. Our culture and our political system and our leaders placed those GIs there. And if we want to prevent future My Lai massacres and future Abu Ghraibs, we must change our culture and our political system and our leaders, because in war we are this close. The film we saw that evening in Hanoi in 1999 has since been used in 5th grade classes in Vietnam. And the last line in the teacher's guide, the teaching guide of that film says, "Everyone must fulfill their responsibility to gradually make the world peaceful." How can we gradually make the world peaceful? I believe personally that we must build the power of our principles and use the principles of our power. The power of our principles will transform us. We need to transform ourselves. When I think about my own spiritual journey, I recall the Vietnamese translation of one of the verses of the Dhammapada that are engraved on a mountain near Da Nang. It says, "Hatreds never cease, by hatreds in this world, by love they cease. This is a law of 1,000 springs." That's my individual project, and I think that's the foundation for all of us living lives of justice and compassion and respect for life. That's absolutely essential. But I think it's not enough. I think in the world we live in today, that's not enough. I say that we must use the principles of power, using all the tools of our democracy, to change our leaders and change the political system that leads to My Lais wherever there is war. So there's no misunderstanding. There have been My Lais through history whenever there's war, and the Vietnamese themselves were not immune to that tendency. I'm speaking about my country, not because we're any more prone to this behavior, I think, than other nations, but because I'm a citizen here, and I have the duty to speak, and I hold my own country to a high standard. So that's why we returned, Jean and I, to New Hampshire in 2005, after 20 years overseas. We came back because we thought, like many of you, I presume, we thought our own country was in trouble and on the wrong track, and we wanted to be part of the solution. So since this past May, this new organization, Just Democracy, has been organizing in progressive communities of faith here in New Hampshire, across the state, to end the war and to stop climate change. So we're working to connect spiritual principles of peace and justice with civic power. And I'm optimistic about that, because I take the words of the great Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, echoed later by Martin Luther King, who said that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. It's long, but it bends towards justice. So I want to close with quoting something that Howard Zinn did once in a great speech. He did so eloquently, and I'm going to mimic that a little bit. We're all familiar with Thomas Jefferson's list of inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but we usually stop reading at that point. He goes on to say, Thomas Jefferson goes on to say, whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. So if we want to end the war, if we want to stop the catastrophe which is climate change, if we want to help bend that moral arc of the universe, it's time to build on the power of our principles, the principles of peace and justice and respect for life, and to use the principles of our power to work together to alter this government and institute a new one.
Thank you, Mark.